Dear grad student, may the fourth episode be with you. Sorry, I physically couldn't allow myself to post a fourth episode without a Star Wars reference, so there you go. Today's conversation is an important one, and so I'm really glad that you're here. In this episode, I'm joined by Annie Reyes to discuss diversity, racism, and privilege in academia. Hello, listeners. Welcome back to Dear Grad Student, the podcast where grad students can come together to celebrate, commiserate, and support one another through this long and difficult journey. I'm Alana. I am a fourth-year doctoral student and your host, and I am joined today by a fifth-year doctoral candidate studying temporal lobe epilepsy, NIH F31 fellow and diversity advocate, Annie Reyes. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me here.
Absolutely. So before we get started talking, where can people find you on Twitter? How can they follow you? Yeah, where are you at?
So my Twitter handle is Annie Reyes Neural, so ANNYREYESNEURO.
Perfect. So everybody listening who already definitely wants to follow Annie, go ahead and do so. And let's go ahead and jump into today's conversation. So Annie has joined me here today to talk about diversity in academia. And at the time of this episode being released, I'm pretty sure it's only going to be my fourth episode. And I know that people listening don't necessarily know me and they don't necessarily know my intentions. And I just want to start with a little bit of a disclaimer here. First, I don't think that I could stand here and say that I am producing a podcast about the grad school experience and not talk about racism or talk about the structural inequality in academia more broadly. And so the conversation that Annie and I are going to have today is not to serve as education for me. Instead, she and I have this basic outline of what we have agreed to put in the episode and what is going to guide our conversation. And yes, I may make mistakes today, and I'm learning, and I'm not afraid of making mistakes, and it's not Annie's job to correct me. So I will continue to learn, and that's, I think, all I have to say about that. I think we're going to jump in the episode. Anything for you to add there, Annie?
No, I'm excited and I'm very grateful that, that you invited me to talk about diversity in academia, which is right now it's something it's in the minds of many, many of us. And I think it's time to kind of shake it up and change things. So I'm very excited to have this conversation.
Yeah, and I really appreciate it. I said this to Annie before we started recording. The podcast does not exist yet. So this has not been launched yet. So again, I appreciate your blind faith in being willing to record this and to jump into, a really important topic with a podcast that only has a Twitter page with one follower right now, or two followers. I think my mom is one of them. So
I'll be the third.
Oh, thanks. There you go. So Annie, you mentioned while we were planning this episode that a good place to start would be, we can't talk about everything coming up here if we don't talk about what is the value of diversity in academia. And for us, more related, what is the value of a more diversified grad student cohort or, grad student body?
Yeah, I mean, when we think about the US, it's a melting pot. We have people from every walks of life, race, ethnicities, different languages, religion, sexual orientation and gender identity, that it should be a reflection. Academia should be a reflection of what the US population looks like. And currently is not. And there might be some diversity in some fields more than others, and specifically in clinical psychology, which is field that I'm part of. There's not much diversity. And when we think about the type of work that we do, we're working with patients of the populations we're serving, whether it's in clinical psychology or just medicine in general, the people serving these populations should represent the groups that we're serving. So I'll give you an example in terms of why diversity is so important. And I'll say with my own personal experience. I grew up, I'm Afro-Latina. I grew up in Washington Heights, New York City, which is predominantly Dominican population and African Americans, right? So I grew up in that environment. That's all I knew, right? So it's pretty much a bubble.
Mm-hmm.
And when I started graduate school, I had a lot of friends who were Asian. They were either Chinese, Japanese, or Korean. And that was an incredible experience for me because I learned about their culture. And that made me more culture aware, right? I think sometimes we think about our own culture and, the group that we belong in. But I think as in academia specifically, it has opened my eyes to understand how other diverse group are and what they value. And that has shaped me as a clinician. right?
Mm,
Now
mm-hmm.
I value other culture the same way that I value mine. So I think it's this whole idea that it's just kind of, we need diversity because someone is telling us without us realizing that it just makes us better scientists, makes us better clinician. And there's actually research out there to show that the more diverse the workplace is, the better quality of life and better work life balance exists. So we know that diversity actually builds a good community. And then when we think about science and medicine, it's even more important because we are serving these populations, these very diverse populations. And just to give you an example, by 2050, the baby boomers are going to be in an age range where they're going to be at a higher risk of developing dementia. And as of now, we do not have the tools or the clinical providers to actually diagnose, treat, and care for these patients who are
Mm,
part of diverse groups. So this is going to turn into a public health crisis because if we don't have enough, let's say, neuropsychologists who are able to culturally diagnose dementia, then we have people who are not going to have access to care, right?
mm,
So it's a public health crisis in terms of medicine and also science, right? The research that we're conducting, if we're trying to find a cure for Alzheimer's, but people are having problems in terms of the recruitment of people from diverse populations, then whatever cure we have, it's not going to work for everyone. Just to give you an example of why diversity is important.
I think that that's a great answer. I really want to highlight two of the things that you touched on. First, I hear a lot about the culture of America being very individualist. And so, what I really like about what you've talked about is you've talked about, hey, it makes me as a scientist improved. And you also talked about the fact that, hey, look at the millions of people who are currently and are going to be impacted by the work and the recruitment that we are doing now. I like that you also talked about, hey, this isn't just about ourselves, and hey, this isn't just about all of these people that maybe you can't visualize in your mind, but it's both. And it's sort of that interaction between the two that does lead it to be this public health crisis, because a lot of people don't see it as that. A lot of people see it as a very other problem. It sounds like you're working in a space where people are very aware of it, and that people are seeing it and that it's important to them. And I think moving into an area like that is more important. All areas need to have this sort of now and later cultural awareness of, hey, yeah, this is a really big issue now, but we are only creating a bigger one by how slowly we are adapting and changing and making these structural and cultural changes in our department. It is only going to be detrimental that this is not happening faster.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the health disparities, to your point, that exists among marginalized community, whether it's African Americans, Latinx, Native Americans, or the LGBTQ communities, is because a lack of representation could be
Hmm.
partially explained by the fact that a lot of the research, a lot of the medical interactions, is due to that. If anything, we could actually see it from that perspective, less than self-serving that someone needs a seat at the table because
Mm,
they've been part of a marginalized community, but more of like we're actually failing the people we're serving because we don't have the representation that we need, right?
yeah.
A lot of the times, people from these marginalized communities are either undertreated or over pathologized, right? So, and that's because sometimes we fail to understand that culture plays a huge role when it comes to medicine.
And it becomes this question too of, okay, so we have this huge societal problem. I think that if anything over the past couple of months, right, this has always existed, and there's a lot of new people and a lot of new voices in all of this. And all of these new voices in here, all of these new conversations, what does this mean to us as students, right? Because we aren't recruiting people, right? We're not part of that process. We don't have labs individually, that is, but we are a part of the culture that we are cultivating and establishing as students in our program. And so, what does it mean as grad students that we play a role in this? It's not just about getting people into programs, right? It can't just be about that, because people could come into a program that is awful in terms of their openness, in terms of how they are unconsciously or consciously treating students of color or students with diverse identities. And so, what is our responsibility?
That's a great question. Just yesterday, I gave we had a really interesting discussion at the American Psychological Association annual convention about the retention of students, and I think what we're starting to see is that there's an issue with retention of faculty,
Mm.
right? And I think it starts really early on. I think we become disheartened by academia very early on, and many of us, for example, don't have the privilege just to drop out of the PhD program or out of medical school because our family is our responsibility. This is kind of the only way out to guarantee that there's some sort of financial security for our loved ones. So we have no choice, right? But what happens is that we see that these graduate students very early on are part of a program that they don't feel welcome, that they don't feel supportive, that they don't feel safe. So then that's created early. And then once we graduate, and we may go into academia, or actually, some people choose not to go to academia at all. And I've seen a lot of stories of very well known, productive, brilliant scientists and faculty in academia who decide to actually leave because it's been a very long journey of not feeling like we belong. And then what happens, right? So now you have less faculty from diverse groups in academia to recruit and mentor students from diverse groups. So it becomes this cycle, right? So I think one of the things to keep in mind is that as graduate students, we're kind of building and contributing to the climate
Hmm.
that leads for us to either decide whether do we want to continue being in this part of this toxic climate that's not welcoming us, or do we just finish and do something else?
Yeah, and even as I hear you talk about like retaining diverse faculty, that is also going to have an impact on what kind of undergraduates are looking and seeing, could I be a part of this? So even at the talking about okay, people that get to the grad level, right? Even like you said, it starts early. When we have fewer undergrads who are able to look and dream and see and feel like they could model that, that in and of itself is a problem. And then you have the people who are able to imagine that, even though they may not have role models, who show up hopeful, likely that, hey, this won't be toxic because professors care. And then, oh, look, it is toxic. And grad students certainly contribute to that. They're certainly not necessarily helping with that. And so I think that we do play this role in climate that you mentioned. And I think that's such a good word for it. And I think that in particular, white students hold a lot of responsibility in that because we are the majority. I can't make any comparison. I have a very small comparison to make. So I'm Jewish and I grew up in an all Jewish community. My high school was public. It was 85% Jewish public high school. And when I moved away to college, not a single person I knew was Jewish. And so it's not the same comparison, but it was this very strange culture shock of nobody knew the holidays I was celebrating or why. I didn't get excused from anything. It was like very strange and uncomfortable. And that like 1/100th, right, somewhat comparison, it should have been on my friends to say, hey, we have a Jewish friend. Let's learn about things that are important to her. And it reminds me, there are grad students. As a white grad student, I should be saying, what do my fellow grad students need from me so that I can say and communicate to them without literally saying, you're safe? I mean, I could say that too, right? But it becomes that question of we need to do, and I say we representing white graduate students, need to do a better job saying, what does this person need to stay? Because the system is already set up to do that for me. So what can I do to do that for them?
You bring in a very important part of intersectionality. Growing up in New York City, I met, a lot of, people from the Jewish community, right? And I've learned that around December, you don't say Merry Christmas to everyone, right?
No.
Just say Happy
I mean, I do
Holidays.
now.
These are things, right? When you're exposed to different cultures, you start appreciating that we're just a melting pot, right? And you start learning how to navigate that with keeping in mind that there are people who may have very different culture from yours, and that's okay. And I think we just think about the majority culture all the time, right? And that point of intersectionality of where there's beauty in being surrounded by people by different walks of life. And I just find it amazing to learn about other cultures and other religions and other things that people do. It just makes it even more special. And that's the important thing that you brought up about asking ourselves, because, for example, I recognize that I have my own privileges, right? When I look back where I grew up, it was a very low SCS community. And when I think about the people I went to school with and where they are now, I'm, very highly educated. And that's a privilege, even though my race and my
Mm,
ethnicity is not. And, my disadvantaged background, I was not. I do have a privilege by being
mhm,
educated. And I have to continue to remind that to myself that when I interact with people from back home, I have to understand that my education was a privilege that perhaps they were not given. Maybe there was something along my path that placed me in a better place than someone who comes from the same background that I did and who perhaps didn't end up going to college.
and I think that that same idea, right, I hate to say that there are still white students in academia who don't see that they have a privilege, A, just from the color of their skin, but B, to be white also means that you have this education, like all of these other things, right? You talk about health disparities that I did not come up against because I'm white growing up, right? So a lot of things build to the point of already coming into a space here in academia where I'm not the minority. It's always hard for me because I always have to try to switch my mind to say like, other people not getting it, is it my responsibility to change that? I don't know, but it's always hard for me to feel like other people aren't recognizing their own privilege because it seems like a fundamental thing. Like you talked about it for you, you're able to see that on an education level. Being able to say, hey, that this different exists, and hey, because that different exists and I'm up on the privilege of that, there's something that, either not necessarily something I can do. Do you know what I'm trying to say here? I just,
Yeah, and I think what I've noticed from some people is that they feel that if they recognize their privilege, that means that their life wasn't any harder, right? That they didn't have
mm-hmm,
any struggles. And that's not, at the end of the day, a privilege is something that you were giving that you have absolutely no control over it, right? It's
mm-hmm.
something that's just there. It doesn't make it that your life was any harder, that you didn't struggle, that maybe there's intersectionality with all these things, right? There's a lot of things that we could consider. I could list a whole thing, an entire thing of, for example, me being with a partner in a heterosexual relationship. That's a privilege, right?
Mm-hmm.
Although I
Mm-hmm.
am a black woman and a black Latinx woman, there's parts of my life and parts of my identity that makes me more privileged in this world that we live on. Doesn't make it that the other things that I experience are any harder. So I think that's one thing that people need to understand is that acknowledging it doesn't make what you went through is not important. I don't know if that makes sense or not, but
No, that makes total sense, and that it was what I was grasping at, and I've heard of people describe it in that way, and I think it's a really helpful way because I think that people are looking for a sense of validation, right? They think that by saying that they have privilege, it's like giving up.
exactly.
And in a way it kind of is, right? But what we're giving up is this like buy-in to white supremacy. I always think about that. I'm like, yeah, but are you really worried about giving that up? And some people are. I like the way that you described it. I like how you talked about, like, hey, what you experienced being hard, whatever that was, is valid. And it doesn't mean you don't have privilege in that area or in some area. And so I think that that's a great way to word it. And when you and I were talking beforehand and we were talking about, diversifying pools of applicants, right? So we've talked a little bit about the things that are impacting people their whole lives and the things that are impacting people once they're in grad school, and you talked about maintaining diverse faculty. You mentioned to me this idea of like removing the GRE or HBCU institution pipelines. Can you talk a little bit about what those actions could do to increase this diversity, right? Let alone maintaining it, which I think is its own beast. What does it mean to be opening doors that are otherwise locked?
Yeah, and I'll give you an example, and I'll give some examples from myself. So it it has to go all the way to high school and even before then, right? The introduction
Mhm.
of students into STEM. So going into high school, and obviously representation matters. So students, when I go back to New York City, I go to high schools, I do career day, and they see me and they see, oh, this is what a scientist also looks like, right? But also too is important for students to see allies in those same roles. One of the reasons is because given that the majority of academia are white scientists and physicians, I think it's important for students to know that they have allies who are going to see their potential, who are going to, advocate for them and recruit them and retain them. That's what happened to me basically. All of my mentors have been white and they have been just incredibly amazing. And, I am here today because they saw something in me. They saw the potential and they really pushed me to apply for awards, apply for fellowships, and they have always been advocating for me. So we need both,
Hmm.
right? I think this is a huge issue to target. And the more people we have at the forefront, the more changes and meaningful change we're going to get done.
Yeah, so I really like what you've said here about like it's gotta be both. I'm really big on the both thing. I'm a DBT therapist, so I'm really big on the dialect thing. But I think that you're absolutely right. This problem of racism does not just lie on the shoulders of people of color to fix or to push forward, and that there is this responsibility of white allies. And I've seen a lot recently about like performative allyship, and people need to be reflective on it's really great that everyone wants to be anti-racist now, and it's really great that people, and I'm definitely guilty of this, liking a bunch of things on Twitter or retweeting things can't be where it ends,
Right.
right? And so, what are you doing in your own department? Or even as graduate students, sometimes we mentor undergraduates. So, for white students, I mean, I guess my thought would be I can't do everything as a white student, meaning that if I wanted to mentor a person of color just like in research things, recognizing that I'm just part of the role and I cannot and should not take on this like white saviorship of them, right? But that I do have this role in allyship to uplift and to help in a way that I can, that is welcoming and that is sort of creates academia to be more of a safe space. Yeah, I have a role to play in that. And I can't just say, oh, my fellow black student will do it, or oh, my fellow other person of color student will do it, because it's not on them to fix the system that they did not build.
Yeah.
So I like what you said about the both aspect. And, I don't exactly know what that looks like for me. And I think that part of doing this episode and part of what has been important in my own reflection has been figuring out what role do I play as a white student. And that was part of why I wanted to have this episode. Like, there's a lot we could do, and it's about time we figure that out.
Yeah, and this has been an issue for the longest, where issues that pertain to diversity, equity, has fall on those same people, those from those same groups, and they have turned this, minority tax, so the cultural tax, right? Where if there's a panel, like usually they get invited to diversity panel, but not necessarily get invited to panels that have to do with the research you do, right? Or when there is a committee formed because an issue has been identified, the person of color is the one that's being asked to do the work without any time, things given to them to actually for them to understand that, hey, this is extra work that we're doing, right? And so to give you an example, like I've noticed that a lot of the students of color in my program are involved in professional service and outreach, right? Most of the people in our diversity committee are students of color or part of the LGBTQ community, right? And a lot of time goes into
Yeah.
that, which means time, we all have the same 24 hours a day. So that means that work takes time away from, doing research, doing clinical work. So it's about recognizing that this takes a lot of work and that it has to be all hands on deck because, as you mentioned, we can't solve a problem that we did not create. We can fix a system that wasn't created for us in the first place, right? So one of the things is to really get involved in a lot of initiatives. And if you do, reach out to someone who's part of a minority group, is to recognize that if you reach out to them, try to figure out a way to compensate their time or just check in terms of, how can we have a discussion about this? But I'll spearhead the initiative, do the hard lifting because I understand that you have all these other things to kind of manage and navigate in that space that you're currently in. So it's definitely all hands on deck and being very conscious about the minority tax.
Yeah, and I'm actually really glad that you brought that up, right? Because not necessarily an elephant in the room, but very obviously, like, this is kind of one of those situations, right? I'm a white person. I'm holding this podcast or I'm making this podcast, and I have reached out to a person, although I had reached out to you, like, do you want to do any episode? I love what you do on Twitter. And this is what we landed on. But there is this reality that me, a white female, has reached out to you about being on the podcast and being like, hey, let's talk about diversity. And so I'm really thankful that you're here. And I've thought about this before where I was like, I can't pay anyone. I have no money. We're grad students. All I can do is let me put this together. I would love just like X amount of your time. And my hope is that, well, I think my hope is that people actually listen to this and that it makes a difference, or somebody feels heard, or a white person who hasn't been opening their ears to something, maybe this is an approachable way for them to talk or hear about this for the first time. And so I do recognize that, like, you are somebody who's putting a lot of time into this. Like, it's part of your Twitter bio, like hashtag diversity in STEM. Like, clearly you're very vocal about it and you're very active about it. And I appreciate your effort and I appreciate your time as it relates to this, but also just in general, because this might sound trivial, but like my Twitter page, I feel like I just see so many more scientists because of what you share. So what you're doing doesn't go unnoticed, even at the level of Twitter. And I think that what you do, it really matters. And I think that me in particular and other people I know, they struggle with taking up space, right? So I think about, like, I want to be part of these diversity initiatives, and where I've like come to realize is, yeah, I'm there to be a part of that, to be another voice, to be an ally, but I'm not necessarily there to lead and to take over and to make decisions and to decide, because yes, I'm part of the people that built the system that's broken, and I need to be a part of fixing it, but I don't need to dictate how.
And just to give you some perspective, I think that that concern about taking up space is something that we all experience, even if we're part of a marginalized group. So I'll give you an example. I am Black, I'm an Afro Latina, right? But I recognize that my experience in the US is very different from African Americans,
Mm.
right? I recognize that as an immigrant, and I'm in this country because of the work the African Americans have put in when it comes to the civil rights movement. So by recognizing that, I phenotypically someone sees me and, they obviously they see me and I'm Black, but understanding that there are things that I may not understand and that I may not share that experience with my African American colleagues and my African American friends, right? Because I come from a different
Mm.
world and I had benefit from their work prior to, the mass immigration of Afro Latinos into the US, right? So I also had been concerned about taking up space. And I'm very aware of trying to navigate that, where I want to elevate those voices and I want to share my experience as a Black woman, but also recognizing that I don't want to take up space because the recent issues are deep rooted, right? It goes 300, 400
Yeah.
years back in US history. And my people didn't experience a different sense of that. So it's something to keep in mind, that it's something that a lot of us are trying to navigate. And it's not unique just to white allies, right? I think it's unique to different people trying to elevate and be there for other groups of people who have been historically marginalized.
I really appreciate that perspective, and also just your honesty in that. I think that it is difficult to talk about some of these things. Not that it shouldn't be, but it can just be hard to take a look and say, I have to do reflecting of my own, right? Despite the fact that you're like, yeah, I am Black and I am Latina, and so that means something different, right? You talked about intersectionality before. It means something and you're able to recognize that. I think it's just like a really good perspective. It helps my own understanding too of some of the thoughts that I'm thinking about and what it means to take up space, because I read a lot online, particularly about white feminists. And it's hard for me to figure out, like, I see a lot about what white women shouldn't do. And all of that makes sense to me. And because of that, I'm trying to navigate what to do. So yeah, I feel like that's a helpful perspective for anyone listening to that. Hey, it's everybody, and it's just something you have to do, particularly white people, particularly people who are at some sort of intersectional identity. And so just to loop back, because I'm conscious that I brought this up before, when we're thinking about this, like, diversity in academia, tell me a little bit about this like HBCU institution pipeline, or like what that is doing to increase and, opening these doors. I see so much on the GRE. I see so much on removing it. Why? I mean, I know why, but tell the people
Yeah.
all the wonderful things
Right.
about removing it.
So, for those who may not know what HBCUs are, so they're historically Black colleges and universities, right? So, there was a time where African Americans, Black students were not allowed to go to predominantly white institutions, right? So, these university has been historically, important in that sense. So, that means that those universities who have large population of Black and African American students, and you think about a pool of diverse with potential, there you got it.
Mm-hmm.
We also have Hispanic serving institutions. So, like San Diego State University in San Diego, California, is considered one of those institutions because it has a majority of students who are Latinx or Hispanic. So why the GRE, right? And it's interesting that we're talking about this because I just tweeted something about that before we started this call.
Oh, perfect.
I'll give you an example. So the SATs, I've read that they were actually created to show that white students were more highly intelligent than other students from other races,
Yeah, it
right?
was eugenics,
So,
right?
yes. So if you think about it, the GREs are created by the same people who have created the SATs. The standardized tests were developed for students who could afford the training, especially the GRE, right? When we think of GRE, it's not a test that's testing any knowledge. Let's say when we think of psychology, it's not testing your knowledge in psychology whatsoever. It's a test on how well can you take a test. And usually that comes along with people going into courses, and they'll teach you tricks on how to answer this question quicker, or they teach you like loops in terms of how to come across the answer.
Yeah.
So it has become a test that is those who are socioeconomically advantaged to pay $1,600, $2,000 to take a course that guarantees you, right? They tell you, it will guarantee you this score, else you get your money back, right? So whenever a test is attached to something like that, it should tell you something. Right? It's a barrier. It's a barrier for students from disadvantaged backgrounds. And from disadvantaged backgrounds includes every race and ethnicity. And that's one important thing for people to keep in mind, that when we talk about eliminating this test, it's not just for minority groups, right? It's for people who are also white, but come from low SES and who grew up in a very disadvantaged background and who don't have those opportunities. So we're advocating for everyone.
And it's really salient to me. So I am at school right now in Appalachia, where we're seeing a lot of the low SES white communities, right? It's just a particular part of the United States where that is really prevalent, right? It also happens to be where the opioid epidemic has really just been rampant, at least outside of like cities. And so it makes me think of that as well, that we're talking about anyone who is disadvantaged. And it's been interesting because I agree with you, and I have always stood on the I hate the GRE pedestal. Like, I've always been that. I'm a fine test taker, but I found the GRE to be really difficult and a roadblock that felt unnecessary to me for what I was doing. And I also have seen voices on Twitter talking about the fact that for some people, this was a way to shine, to say, hey, despite all of my XYZ in my way, look at how good I can do on this. And it's been an interesting perspective to read, because part of me is like, this is a great way to have that elevated, but how many people are benefiting versus how many people aren't?
Right.
It's been interesting to see that on Twitter. I don't know if I've met anyone who's been like, thank God I took the GRE, until I saw Twitter and they're like, the GRE is what did it for me. And I'm like, oh, I can't relate, but that's valid.
Yeah, and that's a valid point. But like as you mentioned, it's like, is this just kind of like a unicorn? Is this a N of one or N of two versus N of like thousands? And I think to me is more, if you were to show me data demonstrating that the GRE predicts,
Anything?
success in school or anything at all, it doesn't.
Yeah.
So, right. So even that person who did well in the GRE and got into graduate school, but had no experience in research, they might actually struggle. And someone who had given them the advice, hey, why don't you get some research experience, get a taste of what it is to do this type of work, and then apply to graduate school. And then you have I don't want to say easier time, because graduate school is not easy at all, but at least you're coming in with at least some knowing of what it takes.
Yeah.
At least that would be my advice I would give people.
Right. Like, you're basically saying, like, you could be 90th percentile in the GRE, but if you've never touched research in your life, it doesn't mean anything.
Right? Because anyone, I mean, if you think about it, there are some really good test takers who could take the GRE with no science background and be on the 99th percentile. Would you take that person over someone who has years of research experience and had taken many courses and clinical experience, or that someone just because of the GRE score?
A lot of people to that would say, well, no, like I wouldn't, but then it becomes this question of cutoffs. So a lot of programs, oh, you have to have at least 50th and blah, blah, blah. And I think about my first time taking it, I didn't get 50th percentile on both. So that was like I thought I knew how to study it, but I didn't. And I didn't get 50th percentile the first time I took it. Here I am, 4 years later. I did make it into a clinical psychology PhD program with an under 5%, whatever. Like, all the other clinical psych people I've had on this podcast. But it took me, and I used Magoosh, which was a lot cheaper than Kaplan, luckily, but it took me 3 tries of taking it. I took the GRE October 14th when apps were due, or I'm sorry, November 14th when apps were due December 1st, because I was still trying to take it. I just wasn't that good at it. So yes, it's great that people are like, no, I wouldn't value that at the end of the day. Well, the GRE is still letting people in the door. And who is it keeping out of that door? And we're not going to know unless we open the door.
Right.
I've also seen talks that people are saying, okay, it's not very predictive, but is this going to help people or hinder them? Well, we might just have to see. And I know that there were people online talking about, are you willing to, lose the people who are going to slip through the cracks because of this? And it's like, I don't know. To me, that feels like such an assumption. Like, we don't know that that's going to happen. We're not really going to know until we try to make this widespread change and see if it's improving things.
Yeah, and I think, you bring a really good point in terms of these cutoff scores, right? And who are we not letting in the door, right? And I think that's the question is, are we losing, really bright students who the GRE is a barrier for them because we have this cutoff scores. I know most programs, what they do is that anything below that cutoff scores, they don't even look at your application.
Mm.
So it's basically you're saying, hey, there is this thing that we have that doesn't predict anything in graduate school. That is the one thing we're going to do to actually eliminate 40% of the applications we look at, right? And I see that as a huge issue. For example, like when we think about the verbal, quantitative was a bit easier for me because I was a biology major and I took a lot of calculus course. I did fairly well on the quantitative one. That's probably one of the things that had something to do with what I was doing in graduate school, but really not. But we think about the verbal. And for clinical psychology programs, when I was applying, the one thing I heard is that, oh, the verbal is the important one for clinical psychology programs.
Yeah, I heard the same thing.
And I freaked out. English is my second language. I learned English when I was 10 years old, and hasn't necessarily been something that I'd struggled with. So naturally, a huge portion of the GRE, the verbal, is to learn words that you would never use in your life. I had to learn, I think over 1,000 words. I'm an index cards person. So I have so many of these words, just memorizing it. And I didn't do well. Naturally, I did worse on the verbal than I did on the quantitative. And I think the quantitative for me was something that was more a reflection of my science background than the verbal was. The verbal was a reflection of English being my second language. And it hasn't actually, I when it comes to writing, I've had, multiple publications, first author publications and multiple awards. It has not been an indication of my writing whatsoever. If anything, my mentors and clinical supervisors remind me that I'm a, excellent writer. But when I was holding on to that score and, the imposter syndrome kicked in and I was like, I already have issues, with my accent and all that stuff. So when someone tells me, oh, the verbal score is the most important one for this PhD or you're getting in, and you hold on to that. So I have huge problems with GREs. I think it's useless. I think we need to look at our applicants in a more holistic way. These programs, especially for clinical psychology, we're training clinicians who are going to interact with people, people with lives, whose lives matter. And we're saying that a score on a standardized test that has been shown to be, I just call it how it is, racist.
Mm-hmm.
So that's your indication that this person's going to be a good clinician. So that's where my problem, kind of is.
Yeah, and that's really where I stand on it as well. I find it really problematic, and it really just feels like people holding on to the way things have been and being uncomfortable with changing that. Of course, I'm a bit naive in that I'm only a fourth year grad student. I didn't enter academia until then. I'm not trying to act like I know everything. I just, from taking it and being a part of that, and exactly what you said, yeah, maybe your verbal was lower, but look at all your academic writing and all of that, and there's hundreds, if not thousands of stories like that. So this isn't just end of
Exactly.
one example. So
Hmm.
yeah, I'm right there with you on it. And as we've been talking, both you and I have been bringing up academic Twitter, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about, I can't remember if it was last week or 2 weeks ago, but the hashtag movement, hashtag Black in Neuro. I saw you very vocal on there, and I would love to just talk about that as a space and what that space meant to the Black community and what sort of the goals were and why that. I mean, it was fantastic in terms of like it coming together. We talked
Hmm.
about this right before the call started, right? So can you talk about a little bit like how did that come together from like what you saw and why that was so important?
Yeah, I personally just want to, as we talked earlier, I want to give a big shout out to the Black Neural, organizers. It was a
Absolutely.
beautiful thing to see how they just got together, they mobilized and created this space for everyone, for
Mhm.
trainees and early career to see ourselves, but for others to see us as well, right? And I think sometimes, we feel isolated when
Mm.
we are in academic spaces and we're the only one that looks like us. And I go to conferences and I could count the number of people who look like me at international conferences, medical conferences, right? So it just kind of brings a sense of isolation and it makes graduate school so much more difficult when there's not some people that you could relate to. And I think it's just seeing all those faces and seeing what people are up to and just seeing the amount of potential and just brilliance in the Black and Neuro group, it was just incredible and uplifting. And it just kind of at least for myself, it reminded me of why I'm doing what I'm doing, right? And that I'm not in this alone, that I'm not isolated, that there's people that look like me out there doing incredible things. And why don't we connect? And I think it was also a reminder, and I brought this earlier, I mentioned this earlier, it was also a reminder to a lot of people that we're not just the diversity hire. We're not just the diversity, that one student that was admitted.
Mhm.
I think there's this whole thing of people think, affirmative action, you're just here because they needed some diversity in this group, right?
Mhm.
And I think when you see the blocking neural, you see the amount of brilliance and success and people just doing incredible things. That just reminds you that, we're here because we deserve to be here and because we
Absolutely.
belong here. And not necessarily because someone just gave us a pass and just gave us a position. And I think and that's something for us to remind ourselves as well because we experience a lot of microaggressions when it
Mhm.
comes to that. So many of us, there was a paper that was circulated around Twitter about students in medicine.
Yeah.
And pretty much what the paper stated was that minority students in medicine are not qualified. They're
Mm.
just checking off that box that these institutions need. And that's really detrimental
Oh yeah.
to anyone's well-being, that you have this paper that went through an editor and through reviewers in an academic journal that's basically telling you that you're just not qualified. And I'll tell you this, I've always felt that I had to work 10 times more to get where I am,
Mhm.
right? So the Neuron Week, just to sum it up, it just reminded me that we belong and that we're doing incredible things. And although we might be the only one in our program, there are others in other subfields of brain sciences out there doing incredible things. And yeah, that was the beauty of it.
I really like what you said at the beginning about shouting out the people who put this together. For everyone listening, I'm going to have links to that Twitter page and the people who created it. They are linked all over that Twitter page. And so I recommend everyone go give them a follow. They share really great information and science and just also positivity and inclusion all over Twitter. And, they came together on Twitter and within 10 days, they became a full on business with, they have a website now. They put together this entire Twitter movement. And the thing for me, like I had this initial gut reaction like, wow, I'm surprised there are so many people part of this. And then I was like, wow, I can't believe my first thought was the surprise. It's one of those things that like it shouldn't be a surprise but it is because of, like what you said, representation and wanting to increase that. It shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that a Black person is a neuroscientist. And I don't mean that it was a surprise to me in that way. It was more of a, if there are this many people out there in the world doing brain science, why don't I see more of them at my university? Why don't I see more of them in my undergrad? Who, like, where are these people? Why aren't they everywhere around me? So I can only imagine what that feels like in terms of being a part of it and feeling isolated. And so I think the movement was also great for me. I started following a bunch of other people, and the science that they share, also wonderful, right? So just bringing more voices to
Hmm.
the table, as we talked about earlier. So it was a really cool movement to be on the outside looking in and seeing. And I really liked your message about how it helped you feel less alone. And you're absolutely right about, like, everyone deserves to be in that place and be in the space that they're at. And I'm glad it served as a reminder for that. And, I hope that that week wasn't the end, and that people listening and people in brain sciences at all levels can get involved and join that and feel less alone.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something really important is the fact that, when we think about these fields, you see predominantly white scientists and physicians. So I think the important thing is that we must elevate,
Mm.
right? Because what we don't understand is that what we're looking at, the outside world is looking at as well. So if we are just looking at a very homogeneous academia setting and climate, that's what the world outside of academia is looking at as well.
Mm-hmm.
That's what that 12-year-old Black girl is looking at. That's what that 15-year-old Hispanic Latinx person is looking at. And they're like, wait, I don't belong in that space because there's not people that look like me. So it's all about elevating these voices that had been marginalized. And now, with the website, you'll find, you go into those profiles and you're going to find Black scientists doing every work you
Everything.
could think of, right?
Yep.
So now we don't have excuses when we look at a panel.
Mm-hmm.
And this is one thing in science, right? We think about these panels. You kind of look at these panels, and there's a panel on women's issues, and all you see is
It's
it's
men.
male
Oh,
physicians, and you're like, but anyways.
yeah. Yeah.
So this movement has been so important, and other movements that are happening within academia, because now you're providing the resource and there's no excuses. It's kind of like, you put your money where your mouth is. If
Mm-hmm.
you're looking for diversifying a panel, diversifying a conference, doing invited speakers, citing people's work, and you're trying to do all of that, now at least for the brain sciences, now you have a one stop when
Yep.
you'll find everyone on there.
Yeah, and I know they're doing that in chemistry as well. I know that they're doing Black in
Yes.
Chem right
Mhm.
now, and, like, Michael B. Jordan, like, shared it, and, like, MC Hammer was retweeting things, and so I'm loving that other areas are doing this as well. And the other part of me is feeling like it is really unfortunate how necessary this is.
Mhm.
And so I think that while we're like, what a great place to celebrate and elevate and promote, and also to say, hello, these are all of these people to, like you said, invited speakers, or, to hire for your universities because they are worthy of hiring. It also should lay as a reminder of, why the hell is this necessary in 2020, and we need to do better, not to eliminate this space that's been made, but why is this not part of the mainstream?
Yeah, it's just been a beautiful thing, and I hope it continues, and I hope
Yeah,
other industries, right? It's because it's in science, it's everywhere,
everywhere.
right? We see this in everywhere, and I think we need to start. Our workforce needs to be a reflection of what the U.S. population looks like, which is going to continue being more diverse.
Yeah, like, we are already behind, right? It would be
Yeah,
one thing if it was at the population level. Even if it was at the population level right now, we would still be behind because of what
right.
we're talking about, like the demographic shifts and things like that. We are coming up at about an hour here. Was there anything that we didn't touch on, or was there anything that you wanted to mention or add into this before we're wrapping up?
Yeah, I just kind of want to just remind that it's really important for students of color to feel value in the program that they're in. And there are multiple ways of doing that. And I think the climate is an important one, right? There are things that directors of programs could do to make sure that the climate is inviting and welcoming. Recruitment is it's definitely important, right? Because the more people you see that look like you, the more welcoming the environment is. Recruitment and retention of faculty as well, who could provide that type of mentorship and support for students. Also financial
Mm,
assistance. I think a lot of students from disadvantaged background, what they're in graduate school or medical school, it's a struggle because a lot of us tend to have responsibilities back home and we're not able to provide that. So, recognizing that in addition to just the struggles that are inherently part of being in a PhD program, there's also other struggles that although we may not be vocal about it, they're there, right? So definitely considering, as mentioned, removing the GRE, finding consultants that would actually show you how to holistically evaluate a candidate. I
mm,
think a lot of programs now that are removing the GRE are putting committees together on how to evaluate candidates, right? Because now
sure.
you have to
Hmm.
figure out a way to look at all these applications.
Yeah.
I would say look for a consultant
Hmm.
because if you're coming up with a plan with the same people who have been evaluating the students, I don't think it's going to be done in a culturally sensitive way. So I think it's the responsible thing to do is find a consultant who's going to show you very creative ways to go about evaluating candidates. I mean, there's people doing out there doing this type of work. So I definitely recommend doing that. I recommend people just speaking with their students and asking them what they need. I
Mm,
think one of the things that I'm noticing with our generations of trainees is that we want to be taught and trained in a culturally sensitive way, especially when it comes to medicine and clinical work. So this is something that everyone is requesting. This is not something that just minority students are requesting. I think having conversations with other students and other programs, this is something that they feel like is lacking. They want to be culturally sensitive and be able to offer these services, but we're not getting the training that we need. So I think there has to be a shift in the curriculum. There has to be a shift in APA accreditation for clinical psychology programs, especially for us who work with patients. We need to do, patient advocacy.
yeah.
We are taught that you separate politics from healthcare. But when politics drives healthcare,
Yep.
this is our job to also be advocates for the patients and the populations we serve.
Yeah, I really like both of those takeaways that, the recommendation that people need to not be afraid to reach out and look for consultation. So, this idea that people who are in programs right now with all of these really wonderful intentions about increasing diversity, they don't need to act like they have all the answers, nor do they necessarily need to trust what they maybe think could be the answer. So, reaching out to a consultant whose job it is to do that, to make sure that it's done properly, right? Because, like we said before, these are people's lives. Like these are potential grad students' lives. And when we're talking about doing admission in a culturally sensitive way, we're also talking about potentially changing somebody's life in a really important way. And so you want to make sure that you don't mess that up and it's not necessarily happening as well as it could. And then this other idea that you mentioned of talking about APA accreditation of programs and the kind of education that programs are doing, it's sort of that similar line. A lot of programs are doing reflection. You see it on Twitter. People are talking about, I want to make sure that I'm talking about more Black scientists, my Psych 101 course is for undergrads, but at the graduate level too, we're required to do multicultural training at some level, and different programs do it differently. My program has a class on it, and so it's just always good to be reflecting on that and making sure that it is an integral part, right? So learning about culturally sensitive practice is not a kind of practice, it is all of practice because every person who
Exactly.
walks into the room walks in with a culture.
Exactly. And I think a lot of people with medicine, they've been very vocal of that race is not a risk factor for health conditions. And it's not. It's a system that was created, the racist system that was created, particularly in this country, that put people in situations and live in environments that put them at higher risk of developing, health conditions. There's a difference between genetics and race, right?
Mhm.
And you just said it beautifully is that culturally practices it should be integrated in everything that we do, right? Everyone has a culture. Everyone has a story to tell that influences their health care and influences, their health conditions. So I think we have to integrate multicultural in everything that we do, in the supervision that we get, how we approach clinical cases. And we're just not getting that. right?
Yeah.
We're not getting that training, which means that we're not offering the services that our patient populations need.
Yeah.
And so there has to be a shift. It
Yeah.
shouldn't just be that students are seeking out these opportunities outside of the program. It has to be integrated. And I think, APA could do a lot better in terms of building a curriculum and holding programs accountable
Yeah.
that they're actually carrying through, these requirements.
Absolutely. And, there was a panel. I also will link this for people below because there was a thread on the APA Twitter page, but there was a panel all about racism in psychology and racism in practice. That APA basically being like, we aren't making changes and we need to. And here's all the information about that. And it kind of is exactly on that point of like, we need to do better. Like, we've made these
Hmm.
promises that we are not holding up to. And I do think that program to program, it differs. So my own personal intuition and feelings is that my program's done a pretty good job. Our multicultural class was very in depth and kind of intensive, and there's been a lot of follow up with our clinical psych students on regular discussions of this since everything came into brighter light in June. So I'm sitting in a place where I'm feeling comfortable, but that's not going to be comfortable in the sense of I'm feeling good about what my department's doing. That's not going to be every program. And that also doesn't mean that my perception of it means that it is going well. And so it's just important for people consistently be reflecting, especially as this social stratosphere is changing and as people are having these realizations, that's all good, but we need to make sure it's coming back down to, are we prepping competent physicians and competent clinicians in the area of culture, social justice, all of that? Because if not, we are actually contributing to a public health crisis, like you mentioned at the beginning.
Exactly. And I think there's no better time than now. And I
Mhm.
think, some of these things are going to take a long time because these systems have been in place for hundreds of years. But I think it's time, and I'm very hopeful for, our generation of trainees, that we're demanding the change. And we're being very vocal about it. And of course, things could come with some repercussions, and some people may just not feel comfortable speaking up, but many of us are. And I think, we're doing it in a very beautiful way because it's personal. When I think about the populations I serve, I think about my mother who doesn't speak English, and always, from a very young age, I had to translate to her. There's no reason why a 12-year-old should be translating medical terms,
Yeah.
and
Hmm.
that's happening every single day. And I think now is the time to make these changes. It's going to take a really long time until we are at a place where medicine and healthcare is no longer a luxury. And
Yes.
people ask me, why did you get into neuropsychology? Because neuropsychology should not be a luxury service.
Wow. Yeah, I mean that's really powerful. I think that is right. We talk about okay, healthcare is a right, but I actually think that what you said is really that next step. It's not just that it's a right. It's that it's not a luxury, right? You talked a lot before about culturally diagnosing dementia. And it's when you said that I was like, wow, and this sounds awful to say, but this is true and I'm not afraid to admit this, but I've never thought about the fact that there are going to be cultural differences there. And how ridiculous is it that as a fourth year clinical psychology PhD student, a year or two out from internship applications, is having this realization live on Zoom for a podcast recording? So
Mhm.
it's things like that that are a little uncomfortable to admit, but we need to be uncomfortable. And by we, I mean white students. Every bit of this is a bit uncomfortable. It's not comfortable learning that a system that you feel safe in is harmful and dangerous for other people. It's not comfortable to realize that you are contributing to future public health crises or that you're sitting back and watching other people suffer and not doing anything about it. But it's true and it's happening. And so I really like how you wrapped that up to just talk about the fact that it shouldn't be a luxury. And as trainees, we really are in a position to either be part of it being a luxury or fighting against it being a luxury. And I mean, I think there's one easy answer, but I know that it's not one easy answer for some people and it's complicated. And, like you said, there's no time but now to be figuring this out. And I also feel kind of hopeful. I'm having conversations with people in my life who I would never have conversations with this about. I'm finding that people are curious in ways they haven't been curious, both in grad school and out. So I'm also hopeful. I'm hopeful that we do see some change. And I think also what you were talking about is like part of why I want to make sure I'm talking about this on the podcast. A, this isn't called Dear White Grad Student, and B, because I think that it's important to hear different perspectives to really drill in that, yes, we feel like we're playing a small role now. I said this at the beginning. What can I do as a student? But it's not just about that. It's also about I want to do XYZ career. And when I get to that place, I better damn well be an ally, and that's what I want to be. So I want to make sure I'm doing it right by then. I want to make sure that's happening. So it's not just about what we're doing now, but how we're even preparing ourselves for those bigger impacts we can make later, like when we're running a lab or when we're independently practicing and things like that. So I really like how you wrapped that up.
Yeah, no, and I think, historically, as much as I love science and medicine, I understand the history, I understand why, marginalized communities had this whole distrust with medicine and healthcare and science.
Yeah.
And they have every right to have that distrust. And I think it's our job, everyone within science and medicine, to change the narrative. And unfortunately, everyone who gets into science and medicine doesn't have the whole goal of creating this accessible for everyone. There's still people writing these papers are very detrimental to marginalized groups.
Yeah.
They're out there, but I think it's time for us to learn how to integrate science and medicine with social advocacy. There's no way to separate the two. I think we need to develop trainees, the future generation of science and clinicians, to be social advocates and to change the narrative and hopefully cultivate a sense of trust within the community. I mean, one of the many reasons why we're in the current situation that we're in with this pandemic is because many people have a distrust for clinicians and scientists. And there's a history and the reason why that's there.
Well, Annie, thank you so much for chatting with me today. I want to make sure we shout out your Twitter page again so that people can follow you if they've forgotten it from the beginning. So why don't you go ahead and give your Twitter handle again, and then anywhere else that people could reach out to you to chat with you or to follow up or anything like that.
Yeah, you could follow me at Annie Reyes Neuro, so ANNYREYESNEURO. That's my Twitter.
Well, Annie, again, thank you so much for joining, and listeners, I'll catch you next time. If you're a grad student and you would like to be a guest on this podcast, you can find the podcast on Twitter at Dear Grad Student, or if you just want to find me online, you can find me on Twitter at Alana_Gloger. That's ELANA_GLOGER. And if you like what you heard, tell your friends. Tell your cohort. Tell those undergrads that you're mentoring. And if you can, please rate, like, and follow Dear Grad Student on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or, wherever you find your other favorite shows. It really does help the podcast out. In today's description, you can find the link to all things #BlackInNeuro, including how to donate to them and other diversity and racism resources. And if today's topic is a topic that you want to discuss with me on the podcast, please reach out. Let's have that conversation. And until next time, warmest regards, best wishes, sincerely, Alana.